It was longer than a mile. It carried elephants, acrobats, entire kitchens, and at its peak, it moved more than 300 people from town to town for nearly 40 weeks a year. The Ringling Brothers Circus train wasn't just transportation, it was a moving world. In its final years, it even had private apartments with Apple computers, satellite TV, washing machines, and full-sized bathtubs, all rolling down the rails. But here's the mystery. How did something that spectacular, something that once defined American entertainment, all but vanish overnight? Stay tuned to find out, as today we uncover the rise and fall of circus trains. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Before we dive into the golden age of circus trains, I want to take a moment to discuss something else that, quite frankly, travels fast and has become a circus in its own way: your personal data. Try this. Google yourself. You notice how much of your personal information is already out there? Well, you might be shocked at just how easily anyone can find out everything about you in seconds. That's right, your personal data, your name, address, phone number, and more. It's all for sale. And what's the worst part? This is a billion-dollar industry. In fact, it was recently discovered that data broker databases were even selling information on US military personnel. So if even those with high levels of security measures aren't safe, what does that mean for the rest of us? That's where Delete Me comes in. I use it personally and recommend it because it works. It removes your information from hundreds of databases where it shouldn't be. And it's not just a one-time fix. Delete Me continuously monitors to ensure your data doesn't resurface. When you sign up, Delete Me scans data broker sites and gives you a detailed report on where your information is exposed. They then remove it and track it to ensure that it stays gone. I tried it myself, and it shocked me to see how many sites had my personal information without my knowledge. In just days, all of that unauthorized data was wiped from multiple databases. So don't let your personal information keep getting sold without your consent. Take control today. Use my code SOCASH or click the link in the description for 20% off. Go to joindeleteme.com/SOCASH, activate your plan, and reclaim your privacy. Don't wait until someone else misuses your data. Protect yourself now. And remember, online privacy isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. Every day you go without protecting your information is another day that anyone can access it. Thanks to Delete Me for sponsoring this video and helping more people take back control of their data. But now, back to the story of the circus train. Long before the roar of steam engines and the mile-long spectacle of circus trains rolling across the American landscape, the idea of the circus had already begun its own long journey through history. The very word circus comes from ancient Rome, where spectacles took place in arenas, massive open-air venues like Circus Maximus, where thousands gathered to watch chariot races, wild animal hunts, and acrobats. But while the Romans gave us the name, they didn't invent what we now think of as the circus. Fast forward to the 18th century England, and that's where we start to recognize the pieces falling into place. When a former cavalryman named Philip Astley is widely credited with creating the modern circus in 1768. He didn't build an arena like the Romans. He simply marked out a circular ring in a field and began performing horse riding tricks. That ring, just 42 feet wide, became a standard for circuses around the world. And Astley didn't stop at horses. Before long, he brought in acrobats, clowns, and jugglers, turning his riding show into a full-blown spectacle. The idea caught on. Traveling performers across Europe adopted the format, and by the early 1800s, the circus had made its way across the Atlantic. American circuses, true to form, went bigger. What began as modest equestrian shows soon expanded into massive touring productions featuring exotic animals, daring stunts, and extravagant pageantry. But here's the thing. In those early days, circuses didn't move on rails. They moved on wheels. Entire shows traveled from town to town by wagon, over rutted roads and rugged terrain. It was slow, back-breaking work. Performers, animals, and equipment alike all had to endure the grind. It limited where they could go, how far they could reach, and how big they could grow. Then came the railroads. By the 1850s and 60s, the U.S. was laced with rail lines, and visionary circus owners saw an opportunity. Why crawl from one town to the next when you could glide across the country overnight? P.T. Burnham was one of the first to embrace this concept, organizing his show Moved by Train in 1872, a logistical leap that changed everything. That's when the circus stopped being just a show and became a moving city, and the golden age of the circus train was ready to begin. It all started in 1872, when P.T. Burnham made this radical change, but it would only take a few years for his rivals to follow suit. Among them, the Ringling Brothers, who began their own traveling show in 1884. Circus trains weren't just transportation, they were a full-scale logistical operation. Dozens of rail cars formed a moving ecosystem. There were sleeper cars for performers and crew, stock cars for animals, flat cars stacked with tents and wagons, and dedicated kitchen cars. For the performers, life aboard meant close quarters, bunk beds, and tight schedules, but also community, routine, and the promise of a new town every day. And remarkably, this wasn't just a place to work, it was a home. Entire families lived aboard the train. Kids were raised on the rails, some even had their own onboard classrooms, with teachers hired by the circus. The pie car was where the company ate. This rolling diner served 3 meals daily to over 200 people. There was even a Pie Car Jr., a smaller setup that followed the crew to the arena in case they couldn't get back between shows. Now, the animals were given their own special cars, placed directly behind the locomotives to give them a smooth ride. Elephants, lions, and horses all had custom enclosures, misting systems for heat, and regular exercise stops along the way. And when they reached town, these animals didn't just disappear into the tent. They paraded through city streets, serving as a type of live advertisement for the show. Scheduling was tight, and advance crews would actually roll into town ahead of the train to plaster posters, secure permits, and prep the grounds. Then came the real arrival, usually in the dead of night. Wagons were rolled off the train using a system of inclined planks and pushed into place. In just a few hours, a grassy field would become a buzzing circus village. Trainmasters oversaw it all. These were the unsung heroes, engineers of motion who choreographed the entire route, where to stop, when to unload, and perhaps most crucially, how to keep 1,300 tons of people, props, and animals on track. And this was no easy task, considering that a circus might travel 20,000 miles in a season, stopping in around 100 cities or more. Though when the circus train arrived, it didn't just sit on display. Typically, it was stashed just outside of town, hidden behind rail yards or industrial buildings, serving as a makeshift headquarters where performers slept between shows, ate, and technical crews repaired whatever needed fixing. Then, after the last curtain dropped, the whole thing packed up again, disappearing into the night, like a dream on rails. But this dream was destined for change. By the mid-20th century, cracks began to show. Cars and highways offered more flexible travel. The railroad declined and cities became harder to access. Smaller circuses downsized to buses and trucks, trading grandeur for mobility. Even giants like Ringling eventually split into 2 separate trains just to reach more towns. But by then, the magic was already thinning. By the mid-1900s, operational costs were rising, while at the same time, public appetite was shifting. Rail yards were disappearing from city centers, making routes harder to schedule. But beyond that, unloading massive flat cars of gear took time, space, and labor. Labor which, in the previous years, were frequently outsourced to the people in the small towns the circus visited. And even these temporary workforces were luxuries that smaller towns no longer offered. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, logistics were grinding down. Crew slept in closed quarters, resources were growing tighter, and repairs were constant. Mechanics and trainmasters had to work miracles with aging equipment, swapping wheels, patching couplers, and praying that bearings would hold. Accidents were becoming more frequent. Now, this was nothing new, and I should have mentioned it previously. So let's go ahead and do a quick look back at some of the dangers that haunted the circus rails for long before this decline. Crashes were nothing new. In 1918, in Hammond, Indiana, disaster killed 86 people when a military train slammed into a stopped circus sleeper. Earlier, in 1889, a derailment near Durand, Michigan, killed 18 performers. These weren't one-offs. Accidents plagued circus trains throughout the 20th century, often due to fatigue, outdated brakes, or poor communication between rail lines. By the time the 1960s rolled in, the risks weren't gone. They were just better managed. But the weight of the entire operation, well, that never got lighter. In other words, the public reception for something like a train derailment was becoming far more volatile. Anyhow, at this point in the story, there were still two Ringling trains crossing the country, the red and blue units, each carrying hundreds of performers, crew, and animals. But the space between the towns was starting to feel wider. The once familiar scene of elephants marching down Main Street or the setup of Big Top now felt more like a novelty than a tradition. Actually, at this point, they were hardly setting up tents at all. Corporate arenas had replaced canvas, meaning convenience had replaced pageantry. And you might very well say that pageantry is what the circus is all about. But the circus's changing ways wasn't the only thing at fault here. There was a general culture shift. As TV sets took over living rooms and theme parks locked down summer vacations, circuses in general, not just their trains, struggled to keep pace. The result was immediate. Crowds were thinner, critics were louder, and every logistical challenge on the tracks felt magnified. By the 1980s, most circus trains had stepped off the rails permanently, and hardly anyone noticed. As the transition wasn't dramatic, it was gradual, town by town, season by season. Performers left, routes shortened, and by 1990, only the titans remained. Among them, the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus train, which in the 90s was the largest privately operated train in the world, still clinging to the grandeur of a golden era now well behind it. For most people in the 2000s, the idea of a circus train sounded like something from a forgotten age, something that perhaps your grandparents might have read to you about in a book. Right up to its final run, the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus train still crisscrossed America like a rolling city, just as it had done for generations. Only now, it came with a few updates. The cast and crew still lived aboard, but their quarters had evolved into modern, compact apartments. Some even had Apple computers on the desk, others had kids' rooms with toys, bunk beds, or even full-sized bathtubs or laundry rooms with washers and dryers installed right into the rail car. A few people even took their dogs on board. This train was long, nearly a mile from engine to caboose, although I'm not sure if it really had a caboose, come to think of it. Anyhow, over 60 cars carried hundreds of people, along with their gear, their animals, and their lives. There were washing machines in some of the carriages, as well as satellite dishes in others. One train master described the entire operation like running a moving apartment complex with its own ecosystem, and he wasn't exaggerating. Between the passenger cars, there was one spot that everyone liked to gather, the vestibule. It was a small platform between cars with just enough space to stand and look out at America rolling by. Performers would keep things like bikes and grills in this area to be used when they stopped in nice cities with sunny weather. Videos found on YouTube show that when the train stopped, even if it was just a brief hold for traffic reasons, people came out to see it. They'd gather along the tracks to admire its scale and the fact that this train had a literal circus on board. For many, it was the first time they'd ever even heard of a circus train. To the crew on board, it had become the norm, but to everyone else seeing it, it felt kind of like magic. At this point, the stock cars had improved dramatically. These carriages were still located right behind the locomotive, ensuring a smoother ride, but the animals now had on-demand water, better ventilation and misting systems, as well as heat and air conditioning. Handlers rode with them, checking on them, feeding them en route, or walking them in pre-arranged sanctuaries across America that the train would visit along their trip. But behind this tradition, the clock was ticking. You see, by 2017, mounting pressure over animal rights, declining ticket sales for the circus, and changing entertainment tastes brought the circus to a halt. After 146 years, Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus officially shut down. And just like that, the world's final circus train made its last journey. Some of the train cars were sold off, a few were preserved, others were just scrapped. But for those who saw it or lived aboard it, there was never anything else like it. A town without a zip code, written across the rails. After the final train pulled into the yard in 2007, dozens of its cars were auctioned off. Some found their way into private collections, whereas others ended up in museums, rail preservation sites, or educational institutions. One of the most notable collections now lives at the Kirby Family Farm in Florida, a nonprofit that preserves and operates several authentic Ringling cars, offering visitors a glimpse into life on board the last great circus train, which is a very good thing, since the rest of it was cut up into scrap, only to be lost forever. Now, culturally, the image of the circus train still resonates. James McMurtry referenced it in his 2005 song, Charlemagne's Hometown, with the lyric, "They tore down the big top, closed the circus train, left nothing behind but a diesel stain." So perhaps we should leave off with the notion that the Ringling Brothers circus train was the last of its kind. It wasn't just a way to move the show, it was the show, a living symbol of spectacle, scale, and story. But as for this story, we've reached our end, so I thank you for watching. Hope you'll support the channel by subscribing. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.